Dr. Jason Prapas is the founder and CEO of FYTO, an automated platform for growing novel, nutrient-dense crops that have ultra-high yields and low resource requirements. Prior to founding FYTO, Jason was the Translational Research Director at MIT's Tata Center for Technology and Design, where he supported projects for large-scale deployment and social impact in developing countries. He co-founded and served as CTO at Factory Ventures, an early-stage investment firm for emerging markets, and began his career growing algae at Green Fuel Technologies. After his talk, he's going to be joined by my partner, Matt Toms, who's also on Jason's board. And I think we get the singular accolade of being his first investor. So we're also proud to hold that. So without further ado, I welcome Jason to the stage.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, I'm going to set a stopwatch. We're ahead of schedule, which means I can be long-winded, which is my favorite. Just kidding, I'm going to set a stopwatch. All right, well, I guess first I'd like to start with a congrats and a thank you. So congrats to the Baukunst team for this next chapter. I'm really excited for you guys. I'm also really excited for the future founders that will be in your portfolio because they get to work with some amazing people. And I guess the thank you I'd like to start with is thanks for having me today. This is a huge pleasure, and it's nice to be out in the world again, meeting with humans. But also a thank you for almost 3 years ago to the day, listening to my now seemingly disparate, raw vision for what FYTO would be, and brilliant mind trust that you are, seeing through that and seeing what we could build, and still early days, but being the first believers in us means the world to me and has set us up to succeed, and hopefully we'll do just that. So thank you for that. And thank you to everybody today for coming and for the event organizers. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about FYTO today. And what I want to start with is a little bit of doom and gloom, but I won't stick on that for too long. We're in a bit of trouble as a species. We have some concurrent gaps that we have to fill. And they go beyond this list, but this is the list that we're really focused on at FYTO. So we have to make somewhere around double the food that we do today as a planet within the next couple decades to meet the projections for the growth of our population. We have to do that with less and less available water. We have to do that with at least 70% reduction in emissions that come from the food system if we're going to meet anything like our climate goals to continue to survive as a species. And this map shows that actually, with the inevitable temperature rise we're going to have, whether it's 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, hopefully not, the available land for growing these crops is getting harder and harder to find. So we're focused on that, and that's a pretty big set of problems to be focusing on. You could call it the Venn diagram because it's pretty dire. So I like puns, yeah. So this is what we grow. And what we're looking at is how could we subtly change everything about agriculture in a way that doesn't feel like we're changing everything about agriculture. And we won't change everything about agriculture, but we're starting with the foundational ingredients, things like protein and starch, things that feed our species and the species that feed our species. And so you look for things that are capable of having nutrients that are really important to supporting life, that are really productive. They need to grow fast in less and less land with less and less water, less and less resources. And they need to be able to do it in ways that don't necessarily feel like a massive change to what we're used to, because I think that's hard and that takes time. And as I tried to point out in the first slide, we maybe don't have as much time as we'd like to make these changes. So this is, we think, a great place to start. We grow a crop. We actually grow a few different types of crops, but they're all aquatic plants that are really special. And so that's credit to biology and evolution, not to us. We do things with them that we'd like some credit for, but I'll get to that in a second. So just looking at what's possible with these biological organisms, you can have a massive increase in the amount of protein, for instance, that's produced in a square foot or an acre, whatever area that you're looking at. And you can do it using much less land, almost no labor if you can automate it, which we'll get to in a second. And you can do it with entirely renewable energy with zero fossil fuel inputs to grow it. And if it sounds too good to be true, it's still really hard to do it. So These things are all true, but it's also still, jury's out on whether we'll be able to pull it off at scale. I like our chances, but it's really hard. So you look at things like alfalfa and soy, and I threw conventional and organic up there to show that actually organic tends to take a yield hit because you're not able to use things like Roundup that allow for weeds to kind of subside. But even at the conventional, where we're using genetically modified organisms that have been doused with chemicals that make it a very competitive environment for the target species, you still actually have pretty modest yields over the last, and I could show a graph of what yields have looked like over the last 50 years. We've doubled the yields in the last 50 years. It's not enough, and it's come at great cost. When you look at the use of these fossil fuels and chemicals, it's not all positives. So we like starting with this possibility as something that's pretty exciting. But as I mentioned, there's some things we have to do to make this work. And this is an image of our prototype system that's been running now for over 2 years, and we're now building much, much bigger systems that we're excited to talk about, but I can't show quite yet because I'm well trained by our patent lawyers. So the keys to scale, we think, again, the plant does a lot of the work for us, and what you have to do is keep it happy. It's an organism. And so you can think of what we're growing, it's a bioreactor, but it's also just a farm. It just looks a little different than the farms you've been to, unless you've been to our farms, which a few people here have. And I think Tyler said it reminded him of going to Jurassic Park, which was like one of the best compliments I've ever had. So we had this vision early on that if you have a type of crop that lends itself to automation, why wouldn't you try to do that? And it all comes down to CapEx and OpEx. If you can grow a crop in a way that allows you to reach scale more quickly without having to train specialized labor and to add that to the cost of goods that's ultimately going to come down to the consumer, then you should really go for that. And so we are a bunch of mechanical engineers that like to put motors on things, but that's not why we did this. We actually did this for the reasons that we think it can reach scale much more quickly. So what this does is it serves as a digital farmer. We have these plants that have certain needs. They need to be fed the right nutrients. They need to be harvested frequently, because to reach those yields that I showed on a previous slide, you have to leave the correct density of plants in the area that they grow in. These reproduce vegetatively, which is a fancy way of saying they split off as clones of one another. You don't need to plant seed. It's really pretty fascinating. So these plants just keep splitting in place and multiplying, and you have to thin the herd everywhere, so to speak, so that they can continue to have that area to grow. And you have to give them the nutrients that they want to be able to keep sustaining that growth. So what that leads to is potentially year-round growth, where you're having to harvest every day and you're having to feed them the nutrients they want every day. And if you were to do that with manual labor, and trust me, I've tried that, it's not very scalable. So this enables this robotic system, and the software that goes along with it that our team has been developing enables the scaled production of these types of plants. So this is the team and actually this is already outdated. We're adding to the team daily. So this is the technology team that's really built this platform. Super proud to be a colleague of theirs. And they're really inspirational to me every day, because everybody comes from different backgrounds. And a big driver for me in starting FYTO, aside from the climate goal, which is our mission, is I wanted to create a really magical place to work where people can really communicate about things that maybe they didn't get exposure to in school or in their other experience, and they could really learn about cool, interesting things, and they could add their piece to it. And that's something that I think is truly part of our culture, and it's felt magical to me and hopefully to these folks as well. And we want to keep sustaining that as we grow the team. And a little plug that we do have a bunch of job openings, so please check out FYTO.us if you know anyone that might want to join something like this. So, we are a tech company, and we have to show that this is not just a concept, that we have a plan for reaching massive scale and making our investors some significant returns so that they can keep growing and keep funding other companies. So we don't have fear that there's not an addressable market here. We're growing protein and starch and other specialty ingredients that if you sum them up, it's hard to find a market that's larger than that. So you really actually have to divide the world in a more logical way so that it doesn't look like you're going after everything. And this is one way you could divide it. FYTO at the top there is the technology developer that is creating this platform that could be leveraged to plug into lots of different food system verticals. We're really focused on the feed side right now, and I'll explain why in a minute, because it's a really important problem. It's also a very massive market that's ripe for disruption. But we can also make food ingredients. We have every essential amino acid for human nutrition in one of the other crops that we grow and that uses our exact same platform to grow. We have amazing biofertilizer products that we've been testing with a range of horticulture products, because FYTO doesn't believe you should all be eating aquatic plants and that's all you should be eating. I agree with Kate that I don't want a future where somebody tells me exactly how I have to do things in this, prescribed sci-fi life. I'd rather leverage what we can do to allow for there to be diverse diets and cultural differences with what people eat. I think we have to preserve that. It's part of what being human is. So by being able to show that we can grow lots of different crops on a plant that actually grows much more quickly than those crops in a much more efficient way, you can really start to imagine the ways in which this can preserve diversity of diets. And then lastly, there's a lot of things that we could clean up with these types of plants. They're very good at sucking nutrients out of water. And so that means on the food and feed side, we have to make sure we pick our feedstocks carefully, because these plants can just gobble things up. But on the environmental remediation side, we can also use different crops to really clean up the environment that we're increasingly polluting. The quiz question is, what's this $200 billion market? And the hint is it goes moo. So cows are arguably the largest crop consumer on the planet. In the state of California, which is its own amazing agricultural production center of the world, the largest crop under cultivation is alfalfa, and it goes to cows. That's also the largest water user in the state of California of all human activities. And almonds get a bad rap. They use a lot of water. Alfalfa uses about 30% more per year. And why is that? Why would we set that up? Well, it's because dairy is actually the largest dollar value agricultural product in California. It's an incredibly important industry. It employs tens of thousands of people. It equates to at least $8 billion in economic activity in the state alone. Massive, massive market. And it's an incredibly important ingredient the world over. So while we really support the developments that are happening in alternatives to animal products, I 100% support those. Interesting fact is I haven't eaten an animal in 20 years, so I've been a vegetarian since high school, and I think that has almost no relevance to what we're doing at FYTO, because I look at the trends of where humanity is and where it's headed, and I tend to believe that animal products are important to the survival of the species, and that will continue to be the case. I've been fortunate to be able to choose my diet because I have that luxury, but over 90% of the vegetarians in the world are not by choice. They're by economic force, that they have to eat that way. So I think, again, to preserve diversity of diet and choice, we have to make way for livestock as an important part of our diet. So if we look at the addressable markets, just in the state of California, our beachhead in the North Bay, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to feed these cows. And then in the Central Valley, which is the largest concentration of cows in the country, it's a nearly $4 billion problem to feed these cows. And it's over 1.4 billion cows on the planet. So we care a lot about cows. You'll hear that word a couple more times. But this is before we even talk about some of the other animals that we're interested in feeding. And this is just an example that something that's really important to us, and I think a lot of companies realize this. We got in front of our potential customers and now our actual customers in as early as we could, before we really even had something to show. Because, and this is something that the Baukunst team, I think, is really helpful in, you got to nail that product market fit as early as you can, because otherwise you'll spend a lot of time developing something that might have been close but isn't quite what anyone wants. And that's a huge opportunity cost. And again, with the timing we have on trying to decarbonize some of these activities, we don't want to mess that part up when all it took was a few dozen conversations with customers to understand how to nail the product. So we're still doing that. We haven't nailed the product, but we've spoken to a lot of dairy farmers, and we've had some very exciting pilots in the last year. And these quotes, we earned these because John's a tough guy to impress. And so when he says he's excited about something, you really start to realize, oh, okay. And then when a nutritionist, and these are the gatekeepers to what a cow eats, says FYTO's highly palatable, it's like the chef's kiss. It's like you got your Michelin star. So it's really exciting when a nutritionist says that a cows seem to like eating your feed. So our whole team is involved in this process, and I think that's maybe a little different, and I would say early evidence is it's important to us that we continue to do that. Because whether you're developing software at FYTO or marketing materials or hardware, understanding the context, I think, is really important for people, particularly highly motivated, intelligent people that want to do something that matters. If they get the context, you actually empower them with the ability to think of new things that you didn't assign as work. They think, well, maybe I should do this, because what I learned from the dairy farmer was they're worried about water this year. And no, we're not a water company, but if we can emphasize how little water we use, maybe that would be good for the marketing person. So that sort of thing happens all the time, and I think it's rooted in everybody getting exposure to the customers. As much as we like cool tech and we see a large addressable market, I think you also have to look and zoom in on what is it going to do for a single farmer? How is this going to help somebody? What's the value that you're harvesting? And does it make sense to do this? And so we think it does. And the reason it does is we can make a superior product that costs less. And if you add to that it uses a lot less resource, it can deeply decarbonize the operation, which is no longer just a nice to have, it's becoming a regulated issue in California. Dairies are unable to meet the laws that are on the books, in some cases, for how much manure they produce, and they're given a nitrogen budget per year of how much they're allowed to keep on the farm. And otherwise it has to get removed and often landfilled, and that leads to nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions. So one cool detail that I haven't mentioned yet is the only input we need to provide our plants is cow manure, and that's something we've developed over time to be able to show this closed loop, where the plants are fed manure that's a problem, and you produce a clean, nutritious feed that's another problem for the farmer. So you can solve two problems with one solution. And these other bullets beyond saving money, I mean, that's an obvious one, but maybe what was less obvious is just the stress of not knowing where the feed's going to come from next month is something we've witnessed time and time again, because it's getting harder and harder to locate ahead of time, where am I going to get the protein for these 500 cows that each high-producing dairy cow needs to eat the caloric intake of a human running 2 marathons in one day, and they need that every day to produce milk. So it's a huge amount of feed, it's a huge amount of nutrient density that's required. And if you can solve that and give a little bit of predictability by putting the resources closer to the farm and have it be a reliable production year-round, that stress reduction is monetizable. It's important. People are willing to pay for that. So just a little bit more on what I was mentioning about where diets appear to be headed. This is, and people that know more about this than we do at FYTO, at the FAO, for instance, are able to deeply model and look at what's happened in different eras of human history, and they can pretty accurately model what we're going to be eating as a species, assuming that things go roughly according to plan. And if we look at the y-axis here is just the amount of livestock, and it's kind of a bulk number of poultry and swine and cows. If it's business as usual, it's going to be the orange line. If it's everything we hope to accomplish with alternative proteins, it's the green line. And I think what you'll notice is it's still going up pretty steeply. And this is because our population growth is increasing steeply, as is the disposable income, which is a good thing, of a lot of emerging market economies. So people are, for the first time in places like India, trying chicken. And in China, the production of swine and chicken is going through the roof. And I think it's a very difficult ethical thing to say, hey, sorry, you got to turn off that spigot because we messed up for the last 50 years in other parts of the world, and you now need to eat only powder that's made from, peas. It's just not realistic. We think you could pretend that that's the way it's going and keep working on something else, but we'd rather not pretend. We'd rather meet the moment with something that we think can actually meet these scenarios. At the same time, we'd love to be able to do both. So this is where I'm going to completely go back on everything I just said. I'm a Greek, or at least half, and I can't help but add a little mythology here. So the Trojan cow concept is, first we feed the cows while we subtly replace them. So the reality is, I think there is going to be traction with alternative proteins. I think it's happening in our bubble here at a significant pace, and that's exciting. And the last thing we want to do is kind of pretend that doesn't exist. So what role can we play? Well, I mentioned the biofertilizer products, so we can grow more crops in a much healthier way that restores soil health and starts to fix carbon in the soil as you grow plants on it. We can also make ingredients that are convincing replacements for animal products. And I think it's okay to have your milk and eat it too. I don't know if that's what I meant to say, but because you can really appreciate that we want a diverse amount of foods in our diet as a species, and it's okay to feed one as a transition, and also come up with radical concepts that disrupt that. And you can look at parallels in the energy industry where you have transition natural gas as a backbone to enabling renewables, and that was actually key to getting so much solar infrastructure installed because of the intermittency of the sun. So we think you can do both, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So our massive goal, and we'll see how we meet this over time, is to take at least a gigaton of carbon out of the atmosphere. And we have very real plans for how to do that, but it's going to take a while. And we look at these different ways in which you can actually have tangible benefits that are measurable. And the way animal feed is produced now is not good enough. If you look at soy production, which is the king of protein, it requires at least 5 million acres of deforestation every year, on average for the last 18 years. We're knocking down trees to grow soy to feed cows. It's exactly how you would screw the climate much faster, and that's what we're doing. So we want to reverse that trend by actually making it economically easier to switch to a FYTO crop if you're a farmer. We want to be farmers for farmers. We don't want to undermine what farmers do. We think they're going to be the change agents in making this food system decarbonized and more resilient. So we want to give them tools that allows them to do that while making even higher profits. Manure management, huge, big, ugly, not talked about enough problem that is ruining our water supply, is greatly escalating the carbon equivalent through methane and nitrous oxide, acid rain further ruining land use. And we think we have a very potent tool for managing waste and upgrading it to something that displaces other carbon-intensive practices. And this is a duck that, like, have you ever felt as good about anything as this duck feels about eating our... This has like become our unofficial mascot. It's a real duck. We still say hi to him every day. And yeah, we're feeding ducks, chickens, and other things. So come find me later in the day if you have any ideas for how we can work together, and super excited to talk to Matt about some questions he's going to grill me with.
I don't know how many times I've heard the FYTO story, but I can't help but tear up a little. Excited about what you and the team are building, and I know it's been many years in the making, and really just every new picture I see of the FYTO farms and farmers is just totally inspiring. So thank you for all the hard work over the years, and much more to come that we're really pumped about. But as we often like to say, all good overnight successes were 10 years in the making. And I know the inspiration for FYTO and kind of what's made FYTO possible today have taken a decade plus. And so tell me a little bit about even before we got together and you incorporated FYTO and you built the team. What got you there? I know some of the story. I don't want to spoil it for folks, but tell us a little about kind of your learnings and inspirations, and maybe more importantly, like what was your moment when you said, there's a real company to be built here. I think we can really do this at scale.
Yeah, and you're right. It has been about a decade since I started growing these weird little organisms, and I had a lot less gray hair when I started. So
I know that.
So I guess for me, I had a really formative experience right out of college where I worked for the world's first algae biofuel company, and it had this amazing value proposition that I just ate up immediately when they came and spoke at my school. And it was about, we're going to take power plant emissions and we're going to grow algae off of it, and we're going to produce biofuel that we can then feed back into the power plant or sell into transportation. And it was a really amazing 4 years for me there. I was a early employee. We set a world record on biomass production. We were National Geographic. It was like, and I was just out of college. It was just like, wow, this is so fun. And it failed. It failed pretty miserably. And I share in that responsibility. I think part of what I learned from that, I never wanted to grow algae again, so we're not growing algae. But also, if you put multidisciplinary, smart people in a room together for long enough, they're going to come up with some pretty amazing technologies. I think what we needed to do better at Greenfuel was maybe understand where the world was at and the market conditions, and it was a little ahead of its time in terms of expecting a consumer to pay more for a fuel that was greener. And luckily, the world conditions are now, I think, favorable to things like that. I think it's deeper in the consciousness of the general public that there's a willingness to pay for a more resilient world, because it's no longer a long-term problem. People are seeing evidence that it's a short-term problem we have to solve. So I started doing very different things, because that was kind of a Greek tragedy in its own way of like love, and I need to not do that for a while. So I worked in the energy sector for a number of years, and then just after my PhD in mechanical engineering, had an opportunity to start an early stage investment fund that was a model where we could help build companies with founders. And it was all focused on how can we bring energy access into emerging markets, places like East Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, that didn't have robust energy infrastructure. And oddly enough, that had me visiting a lot of farms. So I was spending a lot of time learning about agriculture as part of my due diligence on energy, because one of the largest energy users of human activity is how we make food and how we transport that food. And I didn't know anything about that. I didn't grow up on a farm. My dad did, so he used to talk about the old days, but I thought of it like as dad's stories, where I was like, cool, Dad, but that's not what we do. So I came to really, I think the first thing was admire farmers and like think of them in this really, heroic way that we all eat because farmers are willing to do this. And it's a very thankless job. It's a very hard job. It's not luxurious in any way, and it's often very thin margin business, no matter where you are, whether it's California or Kenya. So it started with a deep appreciation of farming and farmers, for me to really listen carefully on what the problems were within their spaces. And I did come to appreciate that different farms around the world of different sizes in different places were quite different. But one of the themes that kept coming up was the cost of the inputs, whether it was a livestock operation or a vegetable growing operation of half acre or 100 acre, that the feed and the fertilizer were 50–60% of their operating costs, and it was strangling their ability to grow, and oftentimes forcing people to be subsistence farmers where they could just keep their immediate family alive by growing things. So that started to become an obsession of mine about 10 years ago. And I don't know why exactly, but I decided to start growing weird stuff in my backyard. So I had decided never to grow algae again, but I hadn't ruled out other things like aquatic plants. And I had some exposure to what was possible theoretically from the algae days. And I just tried my hand. I'm not particularly good at growing tomatoes or basil. I try, but it's not ever been my gift. I'm weirdly good at growing these types of things. So I saw that it was working and got excited and started in kiddie pools and then scaled that up to decently large systems. And then I had this opportunity. So this was all when I was at Factor E, the investment fund. We had the ability to kind of do these internal projects. So I was scaling that up and kind of getting a sense of how it might work. But it wasn't a business yet, and I didn't have a real business hypothesis for what the model might be. But then I had the opportunity to join one of the larger labs at MIT, the Tata Center, that was in some ways just an earlier stage pipeline for things like what I was doing at Factor E. How do we get scientists and engineers to develop purposeful technologies that could really be commercialized and have an impact in things like energy, health, agriculture, water? It was an amazing experience, and we spun a bunch of companies out that are doing really well and having impact. And I had this awesome boss, Rob, at MIT that said, if you're not doing a side hustle at MIT, there's something wrong with you. So like, feel free to keep doing your ag thing. Sounds kind of interesting. And so I was able to keep doing that on nights and weekends without any negative impact to my day-to-day work. And I was spending a lot of time in India as part of my work at the Tata Center, and found some very, very inspired and mission-aligned folks that wanted to do a pilot in India, one of the larger philanthropic groups in India, Tata, that wanted to really try growing aquatic plants at a place that could really test with users whether it was going to make any difference. So that was the first time I grew a meaningful scale of aquatic plants to feed cows, grown off of processed manure from those cows, because it was in a very off-grid, difficult place to operate. And especially for a mechanical engineer that's used to buying things on McMaster-Carr and Automation Direct, it's like I had to plan very carefully what went in my suitcase for prototyping.
Why are you bringing all these kiddie pools?
Yeah, exactly. So that gave me a firm belief that this could change the world after I saw what happened after a year. I saw the yields of the milk from the cows go up substantially. I saw the fat content in the milk, which is how the farmers are paid, go up substantially, and it was more nutrient dense. I saw the cows be healthy after a year, so repeated intervention groups and control groups. So I tried to be very scientific about it. And so I became convinced that the core technology, so to speak, was sound, and I had to start thinking of what doesn't work here. And one of the things that didn't work is I did all of this manually, and I had the luxury of a philanthropic organization donating time with laborers that helped me harvest and feed these plants, and it was awful. It was just drudgery, because think of growing like the most robust garden in your yard that you can imagine, where you have to harvest it every day, and it's heavy, and then you have to feed it every day. Just very labor intensive, and I needed to train people carefully. And so that was another scale challenge that I struggled to imagine, how is this going to work on millions of acres if we have to have academies to train people how to grow these types of plants? Maybe it could work, but it doesn't sound very fast. It doesn't sound like I'm going to have the impact I want as soon as I want. So that's where the mechanical engineer side, and at this point I'd started to work with a master's student at MIT, Valerie, that I was really amazed with the way she thought about things. And she joined as our first employee, and she's still with us, and she's doing an awesome job. So we started thinking about how could we take the natural characteristics of this type of plant that's a free-floating, somewhat easy to manipulate crop, which is very different than a rooted vegetable that has a bunch of chaff material and you have to separate the useful bits. This was a plant that was completely digestible, the whole part. You didn't have to split it into different pieces, and you could move it around with things like pumps, and that actually was something that we were able to automate really quickly. And so we started building robots, and then we realized we're still having to look at crops a lot as people and be like, we should harvest over there, and we should harvest over there. And that makes sense in a farm that's the size of this room, and so you can feed a few cows with that, and that's cool. But if you want to feed 1.4 billion cows, or some meaningful percentage of that, it'd have to be a lot bigger than this room. And you don't necessarily want people to have to be like, I think I see a little bit of plants over there we need to harvest. So that's where we started to really think through, what are the sensors that can really inform the actuators on this device, the pumps, the harvesting devices, that ultimately makes a decision engine. It's sensing just the way a farmer does. Looks at the crop, sees that there's something going on, and then decides what to do next. The unit operation could be, poaching a weed, feeding more nutrients to that area, harvesting. And again, the benefits of this crop are also the things that could cause it to be a big problem. It grows very quickly. So if you're not addressing it in the right ways, you'll have a problem very quickly. And if you are doing it well, it'll be incredibly high yield. So that was the moment I knew, is when this combination of seeing the benefits with users, where we were feeding real animals in a real use case, and actually one of the hardest places to operate in the world, it was still working there. Realizing that I had a team of 2 at least that was willing to kind of join the ranks and really start to fight these challenges. And then, of course, honestly, you guys seeing, and we had an angel investor, Hal, that's still deeply involved in the company. So having smart people that hadn't really been involved in everything we were doing on the past 10 years just hear the potential and ask great questions and figure out with me, like, yeah, you might want to think about it, doing it this way, and this is how I'd, look at your staffing plan, and the nuts and bolts of building a company. It just suddenly felt imperative that I start the company. I was compelled. It wasn't even like, maybe I'll leave MIT. Like MIT was an awesome place to work, but it was exactly the right thing for me to do this.
Yeah, I want to come back to the sensor piece you mentioned and around kind of which technology tools have enabled FYTO to do what it's doing and grow how it's growing. But I'm thinking back to, I think we met maybe 14 years or so ago, shortly after you'd quit algae.
Yep.
You'd given up on algae, and it felt, very similar to how the environment feels today. A lot of excitement around diversifying energy sources. I was doing a bunch of work in residential photovoltaics and utility scale concentrated solar, and there was capital coming in. There was great support from the government. There was a lot of excitement around how do we really build this new energy economy, and a realization about how screwed we were for the rest of humanity. And looking back, on that time, we have a lot of things that I just feel incredibly thankful and excited for. Cheap photovoltaics and real live electric cars that we didn't really think would be possible. But we also had some real battle scars, some pretty visible things that we promised it would work at scale, and it never quite got there on battery technologies and biofuels and other things. What do you think, thinking back to that time, like what from that environment do you feel like has really informed how you're building FYTO and what it means to build a sustainable company in 2022?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. I guess I'd start by looking at the elements that really seemed to me to go wrong with the clean tech spaces I was involved in. And I think overpromising and underdelivering is a surefire way to sour a market for maybe a decade. And that's, I think, what happened is we saw people building really important, incredible things and then making them sound even more incredible than maybe was achievable. And inadvertently, because I don't think a lot of this was intentional, just burning people, burning investors, burning partners, not delivering to customers that were actually your first early adopters and willing to buy something, but it just fell on its face and they looked foolish because you had promised it would work. So we take that really seriously. We don't try to get too involved in the hype cycle, even though it's helpful when there's sudden attention being paid, and this was a great time to be fundraising. We just closed our Series A, and thank you guys for participating. And I can say I believe I did it without overhyping what we do. And that meant that some people weren't as enamored with it because it's animal feed and it's hardware and it's not going to have this hockey stick that looks exactly like software as a service. But the addressable market is massive, and the potential to disrupt deeply ripe for innovation areas is really exciting to the right types of investors. But I think we also have to pay credit to the folks that were in that kind of 2006 to 2012-ish, I think that's the period we're talking about, because it did catalyze some amazing things. PV being cost competitive with fossil fuel energy, proving that there was at least an early wave of consumer interest on things that were cleaner and greener, even if it wasn't pervasive yet. I think now we have legitimate elevated consciousness within the general public. I think it's one of the few things we're starting to see majority consensus on is that climate change is real. Not everybody's there, but I think one of the positives of this really tragic last couple of years with COVID was the elevation of science again, people realizing that when we really need to do something as a species, we can kick ass. We can, and so huge credit to the biomedical community that came out with multiple solutions in under a year to fending off a brand new viral disease. It was just such an inspiring moment for any human to see that be possible. And so I think we can apply that to other areas, to food systems, to energy, to transportation. I think we're seeing that. And I think some of the people that were involved in those early clean tech days weren't wrong.
Right.
The timing just wasn't quite right. And hopefully we're in a better time and people have learned their lesson about overhyping. But I don't know yet.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're here at the inaugural Creative Technologist Conference.
Yes. Woo!
And as we heard from Kate and Tyler, we just get so excited. So we think of the creative technologists, right? And we've got so many interesting new technologies that are just rapidly coming down the cost curve. Things that you read papers about in grad school, and we're just waiting for the day where we'd be able to really use things at scale and in a cheap way, and really get new tools into the field that hadn't been possible before. And I know you can't say too much about kind of the real nuts and bolts of what's behind the doors at FYTO, and without frustrating the lovely patent attorneys. But what can you tell us about kind of what gets you excited from a tools perspective, and what's really kind of empowering some new things to be done in bringing this more sustainable agriculture to market?
Yeah, I think we're really excited to build. These are going to be some of the largest agricultural robots in the world, which kind of doesn't matter, but it's exciting to feel that way, that you're going to make this big hulking piece of hardware that's going to do this important thing. And it's also completely enabled by the breakthroughs that others before us have catalyzed. So batteries coming down that cost curve has been really helpful to us to be able to get a remote autonomous vehicle that's doing something really different. If we had to tether that with cables, it would drive the cost way up. So that's hugely important. We run our current pilot systems. We have 2 operations. They run entirely off of renewable energy. That wouldn't have been cost possible 10 years ago. So PV, anaerobic digesters producing biogas. These are real achievable technologies now that can be afforded. And I think we're not the only company benefiting from them. I think you're seeing lots of examples that these technologies are enabling other technologies to really make sense. I also get really excited in some of the nitty-gritty engineering tools. I was just talking to Jason about what he's working on with config, and I think it's really exciting to see how hardware-focused people can start to realize the software potential that we can use to do our job better as hardware engineers. And we look at things like project management enterprise software as exciting, and we try everything out there to figure out how can we organize our thoughts as a team that's increasingly larger and across different geographies. How can we invent together in ways that is really fast enough to keep pace with what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So we're excited about building big robots that grow plants that are, in some ways, they look familiar. It's green, nutrient-dense plants, but it's different. And so we're excited to kind of open those doors every day and see our green crop being tended to by this crazy thing, and we want to keep building on that and make more of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've heard a lot through your presentation, just a really succinct and comprehensive vision for the technology, but why the technology itself is not enough to build something really impactful, and how the creative side of creative technologists for FYTO, at least from what we've heard, is really around that inspiration to reinvent our food systems and really put us on a pragmatic path to preserving humanity's livelihood. How would you kind of distill what inspires you and what kind of is embodied in the ethos of FYTO from beyond the technology, from kind of the creative side and the inspiration for doing something beyond just bring great tech to market?
Yeah, I think something I've come to really appreciate over time that's a counter to the hype cycle. We try not to engage in that, but storytelling is incredibly important. And having different ways of explaining what you do to different audiences in an accurate but engaging way is crucial to a technology company, to any company. But if I was to go to a dairy farmer and say, we grow macrophytes using computer vision, and it's not that they couldn't understand. Farmers are incredibly resourceful, and if you described it a different way, they'd get it. but it's a surefire way to get them to be bored and say, I've got 10 minutes till I got to milk, so what are we doing here? So if you come in and say, I've got protein cheaper than soy, I can get it to you next Tuesday, and it's going to help you meet that SB 1383 law that's a pain. It doesn't sound like much of a story, but it's got characters and it's got plot, and it's worded in the way that is relatable to the right audiences. So I think adding that to our team, which is something we're actively doing now, is an exciting phase for us, because it's how we project ourselves to the world. It's super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jason, thank you so much for being here. Another plug on the topic of team, FYTO is hiring. Please visit FYTO.us for some job postings. And I think we might have time for 1 or 2 audience questions if anyone has anything they're curious to ask Jason about.
Yes.
All the way in the back.
I know you mentioned IP lawyers a bunch, and I'm wondering how you're thinking, and obviously it's like very, very early, right? But how do you think about balancing protecting your IP, building a company with a lot of value, and the obvious impact this could have on folks who are not going to be able to pay for it in the in the rest of the world?
Yeah, so primarily our IP strategy is around building assets that are investable, because we don't expect free money. And so if you're an investor, and I think part of it is that I have that empathy, having spent a few years as a VC and realizing it's not evil to want there to be value in a company. It's what you get for putting your money in. So we think that's important to capture what's our sustainable competitive advantage in the technology realm, and there's other areas where you can have competitive advantage. But also, we patent because we want to prevent poor replication, because in any technology that could be really powerful and impactful, if it's done wrong, it could be very damaging. And you could have even the best of intentions, and I've been involved in projects where there was a knockoff, and it could hurt people if it's not done well, and not because that was the intention. And so I think it's important still to have some protections around technology that is a safeguard in some ways. It doesn't, patent doesn't mean people won't knock it off, but it's at least a barrier. And then you can actually layer in the decision making of the company how you make it more open access. So even if I don't want you to knock off the technology until you can convince us that you'd be a great partner for us, and then maybe you're a licensee and actually you help us scale, it doesn't mean I don't want the technology to be open source and that you can get access to it economically. And that's core to our mission. Is this has its roots in rural India. We now build it in the North Bay, and it's a very different customer base. But we thought the fastest way to get back to rural areas was actually having the innovation hub that we have in this area allows us to move really quickly and do rapid iteration on prototyping without having to bring kiddie pools on an airplane. But it's actually on a mission to get out to those areas again as quickly as possible to allow it to be accessible. And so that's, as long as I have the honor of being in the seat I'm in, that's going to be core to me. And I think it's actually ingrained in the team, and not because I've brainwashed them, but because that's how they think too. And that's largely been a recruiting tool. It's just, if you think of the world as a place that needs to help each other versus lock out technologies, then please, let's join forces. But it's nuanced, and I think I'm saying some things that are contradictory, and it's something I'm always thinking about, is how do we preserve openness but also build value and protect assets that could otherwise be used for less than good purposes.
Question?
Hello, thanks so much for this presentation. This was just super interesting. I was reading about dirt yesterday, and the timing just felt really good.
Yeah.
Because I saw a point where you were mentioning maybe later on rebuilding soil.
Yeah.
And the thing that I read was about how soil records so much of deep time and the history of the earth, and what does it look? I don't know. I don't know anything about soil beyond what I had just read, and what does it look like to rejuvenate or resuscitate or heal soil?
Yes.
I'm just curious, what you're thinking on that.
Well, I love that question, because that was my original obsession. Was how do we improve soil and make it capable of making crops time and time again, because it seems like those are a little bit at odds, but actually they don't have to be. So soil is so complicated because it varies from foot to foot, and then definitely from mile to mile and country to country. So it's got different physical layers, but it also has different phases throughout seasons and throughout time. And so it is a history of what's happened on that patch of land. And unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the world, that history is not great. Over-application of synthetic fertilizer that boosts short-term yields. Let's say if you apply a bunch of ammonia nitrogen, which is fossil fuel derived, and it comes from very far away typically, because it's produced in a centralized facility and then shipped out. So it's got carbon in transport and it's got carbon in production. And then its last sin is basically mining the other nutrients out of the soil, because you're not replenishing the other things the plant's pulling up. So you're boosting yields for a short period, and then what you end up having is desertification. So it turns into structureless soil that water passes right through. It leads to more runoff when you do apply the new fertilizer, and you've suddenly ruined this really magical blend. So it's, to greatly oversimplify it, and I'm not a soil scientist, but I find myself nerding out a lot on soil science books and learning from our plant science team. You can do a lot more by just adding organic carbon, and I don't mean organic meaning certified organic, I mean chemically organic carbon sources that allow the soil to foster a microbiome where now bacteria and fungi and other organisms make better use of the resources that you're adding. So that could be a cover crop. It doesn't have to be a phyto crop. But let's say you are a corn farmer and then the off season you grow a grass that's nitrogen fixing, which means you don't need to add nitrogen for it to grow. It gets it from the air. Then when you let that die down, you enrich the organic carbon, and that's food for these organisms. And they make it more efficient for the plant that you intend to grow next season, like the corn, to get the nutrients it needs. And so what you see is massive improvements in fertilizer use efficiency. So the other thing that I just find mind-blowing is if you took the inventory of the carbon that's in the soil, it vastly surpasses what's in our terrestrial landscape and atmosphere combined. There is a tremendous potential to fix carbon in the soil in a way that's actually additive to our food production. It doesn't have to be that we put this land aside just to sequester carbon and we use this land and it produces carbon. It can be the same land if you do it right. So that's something that we're really starting to dive into. We've just posted a job for a plant scientist that's going to focus mostly on our soil work. And the potential is really, really high so far. We're seeing some excellent results, but it's early days, so I'll let you know. If
Okay, Jason, thank you so much for
Thank you.
this
Thank you.
presentation. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you
Yeah.
guys. Same, right back at you.
Yeah, and Matt, thanks for joining us. Yeah, cheers, cheers. Old
Let's hug it
friends.
out, Matt.
Yeah, definitely. Let's heal the soil.